great to be joined by our two guests. Ben Brown does terrific work over at Pro Football Focus. And then we've got our good friend Matt Landis, who does great work with the Props and Ops podcast. Always a pleasure to be joined by you guys. And Matt, I will start with you. And we're going to hit on a little bit of a topic that we did last week and sort of come back to it after we discussed it last week. And now we're able to see sort of the fruits of the labor of these two gentlemen. And that's coaching, because I know that you had some takeaways from what we saw week 3, both with Brandon Staley of the Chargers and Nathaniel Hackett of the Denver Broncos. Take me through what you saw and just sort of if you're a little bit more bullish/bearish on either.
Sure. So what I saw from these coaches after we discussed them last week reminded me a lot of one of my favorite books called Thinking in Bets by former pro poker player Annie Duke. And one of my biggest takeaways from reading that book was that over the long run, the process is the result. And in any sample size of one, just because something didn't happen doesn't mean it couldn't have or that it wouldn't happen if you repeated the same process. And when it comes to some of these coaches, there were some things we didn't see that I think we could have seen that still raised some alarm bells. And if we start with Brandon Staley, I feel like if things went different in the end game yesterday, he could have gone from a coach of the year frontrunner to a coach on the hot seat. I mean, we've got a late fourth quarter situation, down 28, without your two best offensive linemen, taking on a good Jacksonville pass rush that can pin its ears back. Having Justin Herbert with his rib cartilage injury still in the game at that stage, I say that qualifies as malpractice to a greater degree than the malpractice the Chargers are currently being sued for by Tyrod Taylor. I don't know why Staley had 3 quarterbacks active if he was going to have Herbert still on the field in those kinds of circumstances. Certainly could have used that third quarterback slot on your active roster for just about any other position, the way the Chargers got smoked by the Jags yesterday. I know that Herbert wanted to be out there on the field with his teammates, and at a certain point, if you're the head coach, I just think you have to know where to draw the line between being the parent and the friend in this relationship. Want to keep your guys happy, but just thankful as a Chargers fan that nothing even worse happened to Herbert. And I'll be quicker, guys, with Nathaniel Hackett. I just feel like it's another case of 1 step forward, 2 steps back for the sidelines in Denver. After week 1, I like that he admitted when he was wrong, the way he managed the end game. After week 2, we hadn't seen much improvement, so they go ahead and hire a game management coach. And I like when somebody's open to finding improvements and admitting when they're wrong. But just because the Broncos have gotten back-to-back wins, it doesn't mean the underlying issues with the process have been fixed. I mean, there were some more perplexing decisions on Sunday night last night. And if the Niners don't go 1 for 10 on third down and -3 in turnovers, plus that safety by Jimmy G, Denver probably doesn't win this game by 1. And I think we're all just wondering, instead of having a 2-1 Broncos team, what's up not only with Staley, but also Nathaniel Hackett, 2 coaches raising a lot of eyebrows in the AFC West.
And I'm so glad that you brought this up, Matt, because you mentioned the Denver Broncos are 2-1 and they don't feel like a 2-1 team. And I'll pose this to you, Ben, because I was talking about this a little bit in the first segment, that not all of these 2-1 starts / these 1-2 starts are built equally. Like, if you take a look at the standings right now, the Las Vegas Raiders are the worst team in the NFL. And are they like a top Super Bowl candidate or anything like that? No, but I think that it's very fair to say that even though the record says 0-3, the Las Vegas Raiders clearly are not the worst team in the NFL. And teams that we saw Monday Night Football and the Dallas Cowboys and the New York Giants, they're 2-1, but they don't necessarily feel like that as well. So when it comes to taking a look at these teams right now, I do think that a lot of it has to do with just taking a look at the actual context between their wins and losses, because not all these 2-1 and 1-2 starts are built equally.
Yeah, definitely. I do think, it's obviously why, from like a sports betting model based perspective, we don't just take into account, only like the win loss or the score differential or those sorts of things into the model, right? We obviously take into account how they, or try to take into account how they kind of arrive down that path of actually winning or losing that particular football game. So, really popular stats like EPA per play, those sorts of things don't really speak too highly from the Denver Broncos, especially, in that week 3 match against the San Francisco 49ers. So we'll see if that kind of carries forward. But I think there are still, a number of cracks in the foundation for them specifically, especially with Russell Wilson at quarterback and how, I guess unimpressive he has been in that particular role. I do think there would be an expectation of a much more dynamic offensive unit moving forward in Denver, but that has not been the case whatsoever. So I do think you can definitely take away that they are, potentially a team to fade in the coming weeks over in the betting market, especially if you can get a decent price on them because they are, priced up because of their win-loss record.
And I do think that when it comes to the 1 and 2 teams as well, some of these are very fascinating. And Matt, I know that you had some thoughts with the Indianapolis Colts. They did not look impressive in their first 2 weeks. They technically weren't an 0-2 team because they entered 0-1-1, which that's going to be very strange, and that's going to trip up a lot of people this year. But with the Colts, they were in need of a win against the Chiefs. It felt like a get-right spot for them, and they were able to get it. Take me through your thoughts on the Colts, because it felt like we were completely down and completely selling this team, so many people in this industry, after just 2 weeks. And little did we, or I feel like many of us also wound up having this team as the top team in their division going in, and I feel like they were able to fortify themselves a little bit more in an AFC South that might be a little bit better than we were thinking going into the week.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the Colts being 1-1-1 at this stage, and I feel like a tie to the Texans might as well feel like a loss, so I don't mind putting them in the same classification as other 1 and 2 teams. And we saw a lot of support in the market for the Colts last week. So if we were to say, okay, they got all that support, and then not only did they cover the spread, but they won outright against the Chiefs, who looked like a juggernaut, I would have expected to come out of yesterday's game a lot more impressed by Indy, but I found it to be a rather unconvincing first win. I mean, the Colts generated less than 4 yards per play offensively. On a net basis, they were minus 1.4 yards per play. They won the turnover battle. That helped them out big time, including a muff punt that set them up with a goal-to-go situation that led to their first touchdown. And then the Chiefs, without Harrison Butker, that reared its head in a major way. They had a missed 34-yard field goal, a missed extra point. Andy Reid's faith in his kicker was likely shaken, as evidenced by him attempting a fake field goal on 4th and 11 rather than kicking a 42-yard field goal, which sounds pretty safe these days. So overall, even though the Colts won and covered, I am not as impressed as I thought I would have been if you had told me the final score of that game ahead of time. Normally, that means I'd be looking to fade them moving forward. But guys, next week hosting the Titans, I'm not exactly eager to take 3 or 3.5 points with Tennessee either. So maybe more watching and learning in that AFC South.
And I'm so glad that you bring up the Titans as well, because they're a little bit of a perplexing team as well. They come out, they knock off the Las Vegas Raiders, so that was a solid win for them. And with the Vegas Raiders, and I will pose this to you, Ben, once again, I feel like they certainly should not be deemed as the worst team in the NFL right now, even though they've got the worst record at 0-3. But it felt like it was two teams that it's sort of hard to make out of what we saw from them last year, now turn it forward to this year, because with the Raiders, they were able to make an improbable postseason run with everything that was surrounding them, between the Harrison Ruggs ordeal, between John Gruden having gotten canned in the middle of the season, having Bisaccia take over as the interim coach, and then the Titans. They were the number 1 seed last year, which I think many of us would be in agreement. They weren't the best team in the AFC, but they were able to get it done there. But what do you make out of these two teams that we saw on Sunday? Because I feel like there's still a lot of puzzle pieces that need to be put together for both of them.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with you. And, the Raiders, 0-3, like you said, probably not the worst team in the NFL, but it does seem like it was almost like a downgrade going from John Gruden to Rich Bisaccia to now Josh McDaniels, with what he's been able to provide through 3 games, especially, what he's getting out of Carr at quarterback. I do think, them bringing in Devontae Adams was supposed to kind of be this final, missing piece overall to their offense. And I did think if they were, kind of in a get-right spot in week 3, we would have seen Devontae Adams kind of dominate that target share. But it was, Matt Collins, it was these other guys. And Devontae Adams wasn't really involved once again for the second straight week. So I think there's a lot more, maybe not necessarily dysfunction, but a lot more, underlying issues with the Raiders that are definitely concerning. And given their, really difficult strength schedule coming up, I don't really see them kind of getting out of this haze or funk too quickly. So I do think they might be a team to unfortunately fade probably throughout the rest of the regular season.
And I do think that in terms of the AFC West as a whole, it was a conference that was built up as the best in the NFL going into the season. We've seen the Broncos go 2-1, but I haven't been impressed by them. Raiders are currently 0-3. Chiefs, they, in my opinion, look like the class of the conference, just because if Justin Herbert is dealing with the rib injury that he is, that is going to be a little bit of an issue for them. So we've got a lot on tap for week 4, and we've got a lot on tap just in terms of the rest of the football season. But coming up next, we're going to be previewing these week 4 games with Ben Brown of Pro Football Focus and Matt Landis of the Props and Ops podcast on the other side here on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. We're being rejoined by Ben Brown, who does a terrific job over at Pro Football Focus, and Matt Landis of the Props and Ops podcast. We led off with Matt in the last segment, so we'll lead off with you, Ben, in this segment. Among the lines that we've got right now up for week 4, which one intrigues you the most, whether it be just a line that you fired in on or one that maybe you're staying away from because you don't know necessarily what to make of it?
Yeah, definitely. And I was wrong on this spot last week, and Matt actually was definitely on the right side. But I have not been a Carolina Panthers believer for the entire season. I do think that in a lot of ways it is still justified. And conversely, I know we've talked a few episodes back, but I did at least somewhat like the Arizona Cardinals to maybe take a step forward. No, they have definitely not done that whatsoever. But I do think in week 4 here, as like a slight road dog at like 1.5. I do think Arizona is a much better team top to bottom. I do think Kyler Murray is a much better quarterback. I think that they kind of, have started to put in place after a pretty difficult start to the season, given the strength schedule that they had. I think they have the pieces to actually maybe put forth a little bit of run here. So I do really like Arizona. Traveling to Carolina, taking on the Panthers. I think that Baker Mayfield's been probably worse than I would have expected. I do think Matt Rule, similar situation, definitely got the victory last week, but this is still a team that I'm actively trying to fade, and I do think that this is kind of the perfect match in order to do that with Arizona Cardinals. So I like Arizona plus 1.5, and I do think that's probably my favorite early week bet that I can write.
It is going to be a fascinating game, and with the Carolina Panthers, I actually did back them just because I couldn't bet on a New Orleans Saints team that they were having a quarterback with a bad back, and typically when you have someone trying to play football with a bad back, that doesn't work out very well, and it did not work out well for the Saints. But, Matt, I know that the game that intrigues you the most, and I think that intrigues just a lot of people right now, that would be this Bengals versus Miami Dolphins game. The Dolphins, after they knock off the Buffalo Bills, they go from on the lookout line being right around about a 1.5, 2-point underdog. Now Miami is a 3.5-point underdog. Do you think that this is justified? Because if you take a look at the results and the results alone, this is a little bit befuddling, but if you take a look at that game, what's all going on with Tua, I think it makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, if they're just leading us to believe that Tua is healthier than he really is and somebody's onto the truth of the matter, then this could make more sense. But if we look at this game right now, Cincinnati laying 3.5, I feel like 4 or 5 years ago, this might have been a pick'em when you've got a 3-0 Dolphins team on top of the world traveling to Cincinnati to take on a team that just got its first win, but they're still 1-2 with a couple pretty ugly losses to start the season. And with that in mind, as I was watching the Bills-Dolphins endgame on Sunday, I was just waiting for a good chance to bet Cincinnati. I felt like Miami got saved by the bell in both halves against the Bills. Buffalo outgained the Dolphins in terms of first downs by, more than double. And then a lot of us have heard the stat of simply plays run thrown around today. Buffalo ran 90 offensive plays. The Dolphins didn't even get to 40 snaps with their offense on the field. And then some of the luck metrics that are extremely important in determining the outcome of any one game, but not always so predictive moving forward. If we look at the red zone, Miami 3 for 3, Buffalo only 2 for 4 at converting red zone trips into touchdowns. Dolphins also win the turnover battle. We can save the butt punt story for another day. And there's the narrative that a lot of Trends players would like too, looking at Cincinnati here. A short turnaround for the Dolphins to a road game on Thursday night off of a game where, again, their defense was on the field for 90 snaps and punishing heat and humidity. But if we look at this price right now, on the other side of 3, I think Bengals minus 3.5 fully prices in all these factors and then some. I know there's another trend. We've got a rookie head coach for the Dolphins going on the road on Thursday night. Historically, that's not a great spot. But I would argue that even though Miami has a rookie head coach in this game, I think they've got the better head coach. And if we look at the schemes between these teams, the Bengals, even their own players have been out there saying it's a little bit too predictable at times. And with Mike McDaniel, the Dolphins have been much less predictable. So I think that factor might get magnified as these teams prepare to take each other on a short week. Ultimately, guys, I feel like Miami's the better team. I know that the situation and home field advantage matter. I just don't know if they matter this much. So if I play anything in this game at this stage, as much as I had the handicap set up for Cincinnati, at the price points, I could only look toward the Dolphins catching 3.5.
And I think that you bring up such a good point with Mike McDaniel, because put me in the camp of someone that wanted to see a bit of something from Mike McDaniel coming into the season, because I thought that Brian Flores was doing a terrific job with the Miami Dolphins. And not even that I thought that McDaniel was going to do a bad job, but I felt like Flores was one of the better coaches in the NFL. going from him to McDaniel, I didn't necessarily know what was going to be happening. And Mike McDaniel, 3 weeks in, he has been absolutely tremendous. So that put me in the camp of someone that has been, I shall say, warmed up on the Miami Dolphins. And on top of that, I know that, Matt, you absolutely love to take a look at teasers for the upcoming weekend. It didn't feel like we had necessarily a lot of good teaser spots in week 3. You had a lot of awkward lines that were sort of sitting there in like the 3.5, 2.5-ish range, and sometimes that can lead to some awkward spots. Are you seeing better spots this week in terms of the card? Because I'm seeing a lot of games that are sort of sitting between like 5 and 6.5.
Yeah, I will say in week 3, something that has stuck out in early betting cycles throughout the first few weeks of the season, a lot of games that open in teaser territory where we can cross through 3 and 7, moving a point spread 6 points in either direction. A lot of times we're seeing games move out of that teaser range earlier in the week than I recall in the past. So at this stage, I think it's helpful to look at the teaser slate for the week ahead, because early on last week, the Cowboys were there for the taking. Same goes for the Packers and the Falcons. None of those teams closed where a 6-point teaser could have crossed them up through the 7. But to bettors who got down early, you got rewarded in week 3. And in week 4, as we start to take a look at some of the teaser options, I liked Ben's look at the Cardinals earlier. And instead of taking the 1.5, I mean, maybe you just like them to win outright, so I understand that. But I think there's a lot of appeal teasing Arizona up to plus 7.5 or plus 8 at some spots. Kind of a bet against the Panthers, establishing a big margin over anybody. As Ben said, Baker Mayfield has not exactly been setting the world on fire. That game also has a relatively low total of 44, so that helps to magnify the relative value of each point we get in teasing the Cardinals up through a touchdown. Of course, in a teaser, it takes at least 2 to tango. I also like a look at the Falcons plus 7.5 against the Browns. Myles Garrett, some disappointing news today. Hopefully he's okay, but it sounds like he had a pretty rough car accident, so he's definitely up in the air for this game. And if he can't go, Marcus Mariota and that Falcons offense have exceeded expectations pretty significantly through the first 3 weeks. So I like the Falcons to keep it close at home against a Jacoby Brissett-led Browns offense. A couple other teams that just make sense from a pure math standpoint. Denver available to take up to plus 8 at the Raiders. Again, just a case where maybe if you're teasing the Broncos, if anything, it's fading the probability of the Raiders beating anybody by a substantial margin. The Bucs also fit this week. They can be taken up to plus 8.5. They are hosting the Chiefs, so it can always be scary betting against the Chiefs blowing out just about anybody. But if you are looking Tampa's way, helps that Mike Evans will be back in the fold after we saw how beleaguered their offense looked without him yesterday against the Packers. And then last but not least, the Rams at San Francisco on Monday night next week. They can be teased up to plus 8.5. Another really low total, 42.5. That's helpful when we look at taking the underdog up through a touchdown. Although I will say there's a fly in the ointment with the Rams. It seems like whenever they take on the Niners, as long as it's been McVay versus Shanahan, San Francisco tends to get the upper hand in that matchup. So I'm particularly at this stage looking toward teams like Arizona, Atlanta, and Denver for the Week 4 teaser card.
And that's a good call, taking a look at just the past history of coaches and how they perform, because, well, Sean McVay, ever since he's gotten to the Rams, he has completely owned the NFC West. That is very fair to say. And then, Ben, we've got one game that I want to get your thoughts on here in the final minute or so, and that's a game that's going to be going down in across the pond. It's going down in the continent of Europe between the Minnesota Vikings and the New Orleans Saints, because this game is happening at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. How do you handicap these games that they do happen across the pond? Because I do think that there's a little bit of a different dynamic, and no doubt you're going to have an early kick time. This one's 6:30 a.m. Pacific.
Yeah, I mean, it's as far away from prime time as Kirk Cousins can get. So I do think that might factor in a little bit to the handicap, but we'll see. I do agree. You know, Matt talked a little bit about the New Orleans Saints and, you know, Jameis Winston being hurt. They've been a team that I think also has kind of not really put it all together. I think they looked pretty good in week 1, but outside of that, Jameis Winston hasn't looked like himself. I do think Sean Payton, you know, no longer being there is probably bigger to that offense than a lot of people project. So give me Minnesota. I do think that, you know, the comeback victory, although it's not necessarily what you want to see against Detroit, did show some things. And I do think they are still very much in contention to an NFC North. So I think they're going to take care of business over in London for all those Vikings fans coming up.
It should be a very fascinating game, and I know that Ben Brown, who does terrific work at Pro Football Focus, along Matt Landis of the Props and Outs podcast, going to be breaking it all down. Always great to get them aboard. Big thanks to them for joining me here on the Greg Peterson Experience, and